In this video, I will talk about the common ways to evaluate user experiences for immersive systems. The key topics are 1. Appreciate the motivation for learning how to evaluate such systems first, prior to learning technical implementation concepts. Next, see how to describe immersion as system properties. And then we will also see how to describe immersion as user experiences, in which we go into a bit more detail and zoom in into 3 experiential constructs that are popular today: presence, flow, and cybersickness. And finally, we will see how we can use the concept of affordances to relate these concepts to design. In learning any new programming framework, we sometimes fall into the trap of continuously learning new feature by new feature, attracted by all the cool things that we can create with this newfound framework. This is also how the flow of most traditional courses tend to occur, covering each technical skill-based concept and leaving evaluation and testing all the way at the end. We often forget that actually the technical concepts are essentially just a means to the end desired immersive user experience, which is what really matters to the users of the systems that we are building. Of course, I'm not discounting the fact that a lot of us do enjoy this process of creation, and oftentimes having the tools that we personally enjoy and fancy is important for our own sanity. But what I'm highlighting here is that what is most important is that we understand that what we are building is something for the users, and we are not just doing it to primarily satisfy ourselves, right? Hence, I think it is important to, at an early stage, acquire a good level of knowledge on how to evaluate the quality of this end product that we are building. In this case, an immersive application. If you're trained in software engineering, you may have heard of test-driven development, or TDD in short. The reason why we are covering evaluation all the way at the start and not at the end is the same as why many modern developers advocate for TDD. In TDD, we create the test cases first, even before coding the features, and then we slowly add more and more code components in order to satisfy the test cases. In this course, we will use the same paradigm and learn how to properly evaluate user experiences of immersive applications first, right at this step, and then cumulatively build up knowledge on how to create such experiences with different technical tools and hardware. So firstly, we need to understand that the system that we are building is an immersive system, and I believe we all have some idea of what a typical immersive system looks like. It is important for us to understand that there are differences when designing for immersion versus designing for other user requirements. Think about when you need to develop an interactive learning simulation for chemical engineering students versus developing a utility application like a to-do app. Which system would you think about immersion more? Actually, more generically, we can think of immersion as a quality or property of any application. And so as developers, when designing an application, we include this decision of how immersive we want the application to be. We hence need to have a clear idea what is this concept of immersion. So what is immersion and how do we measure to determine different levels of immersion? Well, if we look at the dictionary definition, it tells us that immersion is a deep mental involvement in something, which vaguely points us to the right direction. But more specifically, in our context of building systems, we can think of immersion in 2 ways. First, as system properties, and second, as user experiences. As system properties, immersion refers to the specifications of the system that produces immersive experiences. For example, on the specs sheet of the Meta Quest Pro, we can find things like 1800 x 1920 pixel resolution per eye with separate LCDs with local dimming. And then 106 degrees horizontal and 96 degrees vertical FOV or field of view, stereoscopic color pass-through, state-of-the-art eye, face, and motion sensors, a wide range of IPD or interpupillary distance adjustment mechanics, spatial audio, and a 3-mic array. All of these properties are technical qualities of the system that will help to facilitate this feeling of immersion. Also note that we give examples from the hardware side of the system, but we can similarly describe immersion as qualities of the software side of the system. For example, the visual fidelity of the graphics, how realistic the AI-driven human characters are, interaction controls, what forms of natural controls like finger tracking controls are implemented, and so on. On the other hand, as a description of user experience, immersion is a mix of psychological and physiological constructs that becomes a much more complex, yet interesting and rich concept that allows us to measure the desired user experiences. This can greatly inform our designs of immersive applications. So let us now dive into this concept. Understanding the concept of immersion as an experience is an ongoing academic pursuit in the field of human-computer interaction, or HCI. And HCI is actually my main focus of research. In this course, we will focus on 3 popular constructs related to immersion, stemmed from tons of research performed in HCI and related fields. These 3 constructs are namely presence, flow, and cybersickness. Note that these are but only a few constructs that you can use to determine how well your applications have successfully provided an immersive experience to users. So first, presence. Presence is perhaps one of the most key defining experiences of VR applications. And VR applications is considered a key representative for immersive applications. There has been many interpretations of this concept ever since the original paper by Minsky that coined it in 1980. Nevertheless, all the interpretations all converge to a common notion of how much one feels like being transported to an alternate space. The simplest way to put this is that presence describes the feeling of being there. From the abundant research literature that have studied presence, we can break down the concept into various dimensions. This includes perceptions of the degree of environmental interaction and the perceived fidelity and realism of the simulated environment that is conveyed through our senses. Another way is to differentiate between the concept of physical presence versus social presence. Physical presence is the sense of being physically relocated to the virtual space, while social presence is the sense of being around other virtual beings. In addition, it has also been found that individual differences modulates the feeling of presence. For example, people who express personality traits like openness and extroversion tends to experience higher presence. To measure presence, we can either use subjective data, objective data, or a mix of both. In fact, these measurement types are typical to most of HCI research. As the concept of presence is primarily a subjectively defined notion, most have used subjective measures such as self-reporting questionnaires and interviews. An example of a popular validated self-reporting questionnaire is the Eye Group Presence Questionnaire, or IPQ. This can be openly accessed. It segregates presence into 3 parts: spatial presence, involvement, and realness. Roughly speaking, spatial presence is the feeling of physical existence in the virtual space. Involvement is how captivated one is in the virtual world. And realness is how real the virtual world feels compared to the actual world. The IPQ was also the questionnaire that we used in our previous published user study of different VR locomotion methods when we had to develop a VR commuting simulator for the Land Transport Authority of Singapore, or Hold on a second here. Before you carry on with this video, may I suggest that you also watch the CHI presentation for the paper shown at the back here. CHI stands for Human Factors in Computing Systems, an academic conference that the paper was published at. Watching it first may provide you much better context to the discussions that ensue in the rest of this video. This prior study on the VR commuting simulator will be used as a running example throughout the rest of this video whenever we discuss about measuring experiential constructs. If you feel like watching that Kai paper presentation video only after completing this one, it is up to you, but do watch it at some point. Now, back to the video. LTA. In the study with 42 participants, we plotted the average scores of the subdimensions of the IPQ across different ways users performed locomotion, as can be seen here. Although the differences were not significant, this demonstrates how you can use such instruments to inform your application design, as to how different implementation approaches can affect your user experiences related to immersion. In this example, specifically the presence aspect of immersion. The next experiential construct we will look at is flow. Sometimes also referred to as being in the zone, flow can generally be described as a mental state of extreme positive engagement, such that a person loses his or her self-consciousness. It is a feeling of high concentration, yet effortless and spontaneous performance of an activity that is associated with a pure feeling of happiness. Whenever I think of flow, I think of this image of the famous musician Kitaro when he's performing, totally engrossed in his own music, without a bother about how he looks to the world. Flow is also often used to explain game experiences. Ever thought about how your experience was when you are playing your favorite MMOG, clearing a very difficult dungeon with a bunch of your friends, all through the night? Even for simplistic games like Flappy Birds, it can also be explained using the concept of flow as to why so many people are addicted at the time to it. Shameless plug for my old article linked over here. From the original author, Csikszentmihalyi, flow has 8 dimensions, or 8 subconstructs. The first dimension is a sense of clear goals and knowing that there is immediate feedback. 2. A level of challenge that is matching of your skill, not too hard and not too easy. 3. Complete concentration on the task at hand, oblivious to interactions. 4. Loss of self-consciousness, losing the awareness of yourself and the surroundings. 5. Sense of control, feeling of total control of your actions and decisions. 6. Effortlessness, where you feel at ease in performing even very difficult and often seemingly tiring actions as part of the activity. 7. Transformation of time, feeling that time is warped. Think about how short it feels when you're playing an intense game all through the night. 8. An autotelic experience, where you are intrinsically motivated by purely the action of doing this activity and not by anything extrinsic like money. For example, I often find myself in a flow state when cycling. As you can see over here at my back, my bike is always parked in my office and I cycle to work every day unless there is bad weather. And actually I cycle to everywhere if I can afford it, unless there is bad weather or I have not enough time. So if I were to place my experience of cycling in the dimensions of flow, this is how it would go. So first dimension, I always know exactly where I'm going, and every pedal that I make gives me feedback on how much distance I am covering. 2. I cycle with a speed that is not too easy and yet not too exhausting. 3. I'm in full concentration when cycling, especially when I'm on the road. 4. When I'm cycling hard, I actually don't care at all what I'm doing and how others are looking at me. 5. I feel in total control of how my bike actually responds and moves according to my pedaling actions. 6. I make no effort in waking up in the morning and putting on my cycling gear and preparing my bike to go to the office. And even during cycling, although of course, I would feel very tired when I'm really pushing it. But still, I feel no effort in continuing that activity continuously. 7. I lose track of time when I'm cycling. For example, in an extreme example, if I'm doing a round the island trip or long cycling trip, I just continue without bothering too much about how time passed. In fact, I find that time passes really quickly. 8. I cycle as I enjoy the action of cycling itself and not because it earns me any money. And in fact, it is sort of like the reverse. I spend too much money on cycling. So that is my description of cycling placed in the context of the 8 dimensions of flow. But what if you need to measure flow across many participants? So flow is commonly measured by well-validated questionnaire instruments with longer versions like the Flow State Scale 2, which is the second version of the famous Flow State Scale. This is for assessing complete activities, complete and longer, fuller activities, while there are also shorter versions like the Flow Short Scale for frequently sampling experiences in the midst of them performing activities. Also, some researchers have attempted to associate more objective physiological measures to flow. In the study we did on the VR commuting simulator for LTA, we employed the flow short scale for participants in between different locomotion experimental conditions to find out whether there were differences in their flow states. Firstly, note that the flow short scale consolidates many of the 8 dimensions into 3 abstract subconstructs: overall flow, absorption by activity, and fluency of performance. Here we can see that overall flow was somewhat the same across all conditions. However, for fluency of performance, we can see that participants generally felt that they performed more fluently in the head bobbing condition versus the full body condition, although the difference is not large. With this detailed explanation of flow, I hope you can differentiate between flow and presence, two concepts that contribute similarly to the experience of immersion, but in very different ways. A person can be highly engrossed in a VR experience without feeling presence. The third concept that I will talk about is cybersickness, which in contrast to the previous two is an undesirable experience. Well, most of the time for most people at least. Cybersickness, as the name implies, refers to symptoms of sickness due to cyber activities. In this case with immersive systems like AR and VR. These symptoms include nausea, dizziness, disorientation, and other physical discomforts that arise from interacting with this AR, VR, MR, in general, immersive systems. To measure cybersickness, the most common way is similarly using validated questionnaires. The gold standard measure is the Simulator Sickness Questionnaire, or the SSQ, which was actually derived from a motion sickness questionnaire ages ago, in 1988, when head-mounted displays was not even a thing, and the experiences targeted were basically simulations on a screen, on a flat screen. It is generally acknowledged that there is a need for more varied and adequate measures for the varying types of immersive experiences that we have today. But so far, none has taken the crown from the SSQ. However, there are a few that are gaining a good amount of traction. This includes the VRSQ, or VR Sickness Questionnaire, and the CSQ, or Cyber Sickness Questionnaire. Personally, I would choose these newer instruments if I needed proper design knowledge for developing a real actual VR application. But I will still fall back to the SSQ if I'm performing pure research to extend existing knowledge so that my results are comparable with prior studies from others. All these instruments have subconstructs that group the items into symptom categories like oculomotor symptoms and disorientation symptoms like in the VRSQ. In a much earlier paper we published when the Oculus DK1 or Development Kit 1 was first released, we ran a study on users playing Valve's original Half-Life 2 game in both a desktop as well as a VR condition. And we had some very interesting results related to cybersickness. We obtained both quantitative physiological data, for example, skin conductance sensors on their fingers, on the controllers, heart rate from a chest strap, as well as EMG or electromyography signals from muscle sensors on the face. We also collected qualitative think-aloud accounts of players by asking them to watch their own replays and voicing out their thoughts on what they experienced at each point of time. In terms of cybersickness, yes, indeed it negatively affected immersion most of the time. But the more interesting finding was how it sometimes seemed to enhance immersion. One participant mentioned how he felt a stronger adversarial desire as the cybersickness intensified his feelings of getting hurt by the zombie-like enemies in the Half-Life game. His physiological responses, like higher arousal signals, also corroborated with his verbal accounts. Importantly, he mentioned how awestruck he was by the experience that was mediated by the feelings of cybersickness. That was early days. So from my own research, as well as many others in the HCI field, there seems to be no clear conclusion on how cybersickness actually interacts with immersion. And the general understanding of cybersickness is also pretty shallow, and there's just no clear understanding of the causes and relationships with related other factors. For example, several large systematic reviews that consolidated prior research papers have found unclear and sometimes conflicting evidence for relationships with things like hardware specifications, immersion factors like presence, as well as demographic factors like age. So the most well-accepted theory established from science is currently that higher visual vestibular conflict causes more intense symptoms of cybersickness. So this visual vestibular conflict refers to the disparity between what you are seeing visually through the device versus what your sensory system tells you about motion, position, and orientation. This sensory system is known as the vestibular system, and it is a set of organs found in our inner ear. There are some good VR application design guidelines that are based on reducing this visual vestibular conflict and appears to have good results in practice. In general, the advice is that we should try to match the real-world actions as close as possible to a person's view of the visual virtual environment viewed through the device. In the study with the VR commuting simulator for LTA, we similarly employed a measure of cybersickness. In our case, we used the VR SQ as we needed appropriate design knowledge for the design of an actual tool that we will deliver to LTA. We can see that the overall cybersickness scores were actually very low across all the conditions in our study, which was actually very good for us. However, for those who have experienced cybersickness, we can also further see that for oculomotor symptoms, which are symptoms related to the eyes, participants have slightly higher sickness in the full body condition than the rest. Overall, we can also see that arm swinging had the highest sickness and leg lift had the lowest. This aligns well with what we understand about visual vestibular conflict as mentioned a while ago. In the leg lift condition, participants moved their legs more and so were more aligned with the walking action they viewed through the HTC Vive HMD that we used for the experiment. Whereas for the arm swing condition, participants moved much less, mostly just swinging their arms casually without much fatigue, and this caused more disparity with what they are seeing in the Vive. Next, we will talk about affordances. Now that we understand immersion from both systems perspective and the user's perspective, it is useful to talk about this concept called affordances. This is an important HCI concept coined by the psychologist James Gibson and made popular in Donald Norman's famous book, The Design of Everyday Things. If you're into designing, of anything for that matter, I do recommend this great book that discusses many other important design concepts other than affordances. Note that this video is not sponsored by Dr. Norman or sadly for anybody, sponsored by anybody for that matter. Okay, maybe except for SIT. So Affordances provides a useful conceptual design tool to relate system properties to user experiences. The most famous example to understand affordances is that of Norman's doors. An affordance refers to the relationship between the properties of an object, like the door behind me, and the capabilities of an agent, like an able-bodied person like me. This relationship that determines just how the object could possibly be used. When I see a knob on the door, it affords turning to me. This is a combination of visual signals such as the shape of the knob, existing on an entryway obstacle, that door, that I want to move, and at the same time, me knowing that I have hands that I can wrap around the knob. This relationship, and on top of that, my experience with how things work in the world. So all this information act together to provide me the affordance of wanting to turn the knob intuitively. Note how my explanation here always include both the object, the door, and the agent, me, as affordance describes a relationship. Other examples for a person like me would be, for example, how stairs afford climbing and how underlined text on a website affords clicking. Now, so what is this Norman's door that I mentioned a while ago? If you Googled it, you will see examples of doors that are meant to be push only, but has handles that afford pulling on them. We still see this commonly in real life as well. How doors with handles have signs on them that says push. Next time, please don't scold your kid for not reading the sign on the door and yanking on it, although it is meant for pushing. Because the intuition to pull on the door handle is much, much greater than that of reading the sign. And that is affordance. In VR applications that simulate the real world, often these affordances work the same way, which usually causes a big usability problem. We often see many objects in VR that look like the real thing. For example, the door again, in VR, which has the same looking knob, but the developers did not implement the interaction for it in VR. And so when we reach out for the door using our VR controller, it just does nothing. So keep in mind that understanding the concept of affordances has profound impacts on the user experiences. We will revisit this concept of affordances in the context of immersive applications a lot when we discuss different interaction designs in future videos. For now, see you.